So a talk about agriculture couldn't be complete without talking about GMOs because they've really changed how we do agriculture. So this video is going to dive into just what is a GMO and how do we do it and how it's different than some other things that happen in agriculture. And a future video is going to look more into the impacts of GMOs. So let's just start off with talking about what it is. So a GMO, what that means is a genetically modified organism. Now, hence that term organism. So typically when we hear in the news or read articles about GMOs, it's almost exclusively about things we eat. And while that is maybe where a lot of the contention is, GMO technology has been around for a long time and used in a lot of different contexts. We'll explore one of those contexts now, but then we'll also talk about some other things in a future video. So let's talk about just how they're made, and then I'm going to explain this picture of this rose. So GMOs are created using a type of technology called recombinant DNA. And take a look at that recombinant. You can almost think of it as recombine. What's really cool about DNA is that all living things, bacteria, mushrooms, plants, animals, we all have DNA. And not just we all have DNA, but our DNA looks incredibly similar. You've probably heard like, oh, humans and chimpanzees have 99% the same DNA, blah, blah, blah. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I made up that number. But that doesn't mean, oh, like it's 1% different. The genes are different. The way DNA is arranged is different. But DNA boils down to just molecules. DNA boils down to 4 building blocks. I'm going to list them. You don't need to write them though, but I bring it up in case you're like, oh, like this kind of sounds familiar. So all DNA across all organisms has 4 building blocks: guanine, cytosine, thymine, adenine. Maybe once upon a time you learned about the A, T's, and G's and C's. We typically talk about it in humans, but every living thing has those same letters. How many letters and how those letters are arranged is what makes us different from chimpanzees, which makes chimpanzees different from fungi, which makes that mushroom different from the bacteria that is making you sick. But we all have those 4 same base pairs. So let's talk about GMOs now. Essentially what GMOs is doing, and this picture is, or this diagram is kind of showing it, is that we can open up DNA and we can place new building blocks in it. Our bodies just need A, T, G, and C. Our bodies just read the recipe. So what will happen with GMOs is we might have one organism and we insert a gene, we insert a fragment of DNA from another organism, and our bodies can read it because our body's like, oh, I see those A, T's, G's, and C's. I know what to read. I know what to make. So let me give you this example of this rose. Now, this is called a blue rose, and you may be like, that is not blue, it's purple. I don't disagree with you, but it's called a blue rose, and the reason it's called a blue rose is roses typically red. The reason this one is blue is that DNA from a pansy, which is a different type of flower, pansies can make a really deep blue. Scientists, now this is not what this image is showing us, but essentially scientists took this pansy DNA, they took out the part of DNA that makes the color blue, so we have the technology to take out that piece of DNA, and they literally inserted it into rose DNA. And the rose, when it goes to read the DNA, is like, ah, A's, T's, G's, and C's, my favorite friends. And the rose just starts making it. Now, it gets expressed differently because a rose is not a pansy. So we do get something closer to blue, but it's not blue because there's other things happening in the rose. So that's more or less how GMOs work. There's some really cool GMO technology out there, some of which we'll talk about, but we'll focus on agriculture. So this was for a rose, but we can do this in our foods. We can do this in corn. We can do this in fish. We can do this in cows. We can do this in a lot of ways that benefit us. And we'll explore in a little bit why or what we can do with our food crops to make them better. Now, before we get too far, something I do want to point out is the difference between cultivars and GMOs. Cultivars, also you might hear breeds, you might hear strains. Thinking about COVID, you might be hearing new strains of COVID. So strain and cultivar is kind of a similar term. And the reason I want to make this emphasis is because there's debate that surrounds GMOs, and sometimes the debate is unfounded. So let me just explain what a cultivar is. So the crops and foods that you buy at the grocery store is not how it exists in nature. We, as humans, as society, have cultivated crops. It's something called artificial selection. It's also sometimes called selective breeding. Same thing. So for example, here's corn. The far left thing you see, this teosint, could be totally pronounced differently, is what corn is in the wild. Like 100%, this is how nature grew this plant. And way back when I'm saying way back when, we're talking thousands of years ago, early humans would try it. They're like, it's a little something here. Not so great, but there's variation in plants, just like there's variation in people. Some people are taller, some are shorter, some are wider, some are thinner, some have good tastingness. I'm trying to make the connection to corn. So corn, same thing. Some of this teosinte was larger, maybe had more kernels. And so what we did is we started breeding the ones that had larger kernels, the ones that were bigger than the other ones. We controlled who reproduced to pass those genes to the next generation. And so what you're seeing in these pictures is generation after generation after generation to what we have as modern corn looks absolutely nothing like actual corn. But here's this modern corn, something that has a lot more kernels, probably has more nutrition, probably can feed a whole lot more people than the original corn plant. But here's the thing. Some people argue we've modified its DNA. And I don't want to say those people are wrong, but it's important to understand where they're coming from. Yes, in a way we've modified it in the sense that we've controlled who reproduces and who doesn't, but we never introduced DNA into this corn. The traits that we see with the apples in the store, with the broccoli in the store, those were traits broccoli already had. We just selected for those traits by having those crops reproduce with others. This is exactly how different dog breeds came to be today. The reason we have incredibly small dogs like Chihuahuas is because we kept breeding small and smaller dogs. They kept making puppies that were smaller and smaller. Same with Great Danes in the other direction. So that's a cultivar. What you see in the grocery store is not what you see in the wild because of hundreds, if not thousands of years of us selectively breeding them. A GMO, for the definition of this class, is when we take DNA from a different organism and put it in another organism. And I emphasize this because some people, and we're going to talk about this video in a second, some people consider everything you see on this screen a GMO. But in another video, we're going to talk about labeling laws and bans against GMOs. It is not against cultivars. There is not a debate of like, oh my God, cultivars are bad. Like, that doesn't exist. When people are talking about GMOs and laws and things, it's about DNA from one organism into another organism. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you pause. There's a link to a video that's going to be popping up in a moment. I'm going to describe it first. With Neil deGrasse Tyson. You might recognize that name. He's a pretty famous physicist. And in this video, someone is doing an interview of him, asking him about his stand on GMOs. He thinks there's nothing wrong with GMOs, and that's fine. I don't have whatever opinion you want to. He's a really smart guy. He's done his research. But listen to his arguments. When he talks about GMOs, he's including cultivars in his definition of GMOs. So honestly, the whole point of me talking about this slide is one, so you learn what cultivars are, but two, if you're going to talk with someone about GMOs, make sure you're on the same page with your definition of GMOs. It's really hard to have a good, educated, productive conversation with someone if their idea of a GMO is different from your idea of a GMO. In this class, we're going to go with GMO is DNA from one inserted into another. That's what the laws are based on, and that's what we're going to discuss more. So go ahead, pause here, click on the link, watch this short interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson to learn a little bit more about the different definitions of GMOs that people have. So hopefully you got a little bit of insight, and hopefully it helps you have better conversations with people in the future. So let's bring it back to agriculture. Why or what have we accomplished with GMOs when it comes to agriculture? Now, while I'm showing you corn in this picture, like we use GMOs with a lot of foods. So for example, when I say a lot of foods, here in the United States, if you go to the grocery store, about 80% of all processed food. And a way you can think about with processed food is things that come in a box or in a bag. About 80% of all processed food in the United States has at least one GMO in it. You eat GMOs unless you are eating 100% organic or you never eat anything out of boxes. You are most likely eating GMOs. You ate cereal this morning? Probably a GMO. You had a sandwich? You used bread? Probably having a GMO. You made brownies? Probably some GMOs in there. So like there's GMOs everywhere in our diet. And for good reason. Like we have GMOs because they work. So here's a list of just different characteristics. We're going to explore one of them more in a moment. So we can put in genes into corn that makes it so they almost make their own pesticide. Not like a chemical pesticide like you're thinking of, but just it makes a substance that kills moths. These two pictures is comparing the non-GMO corn on the left with the GMO corn on the right. A caterpillar starts eating it and it dies from whatever chemical this is producing. And so therefore, you have corn. You have more corn. You can sell more corn. We as consumers, we can buy more corn. Now, I don't want you to be like, oh my God, but then I eat it. It's like, oh, this is a horrible analogy because I can't think of a better one. So poison ivy. You should not eat poison ivy. Humans, by and large, are allergic to it. But maybe your dog, I don't know, your dog eats poison ivy and is fine because that poison doesn't impact dogs. That's not a great example, but it's the best I can think of. So yes, that corn might produce something that kills caterpillars, but we as humans are fine consuming it. We've been able to make foods that have more nutrition. So we've created rice that can create vitamin A. So it has more nutrients in it, which is really great for poorer regions that lack a diversity in diet. We can grow crops in more places because we've been able to insert genes that make them resist drought. Really great in the face of climate change. We've been able to make crops that can resist disease. So a disease that's killing all mangoes, we've been able to engineer so that they don't die from this disease. We've been able to make our crops have a longer shelf life. They can go to the farmer, to the grocery store, to your home, and take twice the time and not spoil and not go rotten. This isn't just great for the farmer being able to sell, but this is great for us to reduce food waste. We buy a tomato and instead of needing to eat it in 2 days, we've got 5. That's a big deal. This last one is a kind of weird concept, so I have a slide just devoted to it, this herbicide resistance. So let's just jump to that next slide to explore it more. So one of the most commonly used, I say one of, the most, it is number one, the most commonly used pesticide on our agriculture is Roundup. Roundup is an herbicide. And you might be familiar with it because you can actually buy it like here. You can go to Home Depot or Lowe's and buy Roundup for your lawn. And so Roundup, really powerful herbicide, you would use it against weeds. And remember, weeds are going to take away sunlight, water, nutrients from the plants that you want. Now, before, farmers had to be incredibly careful spraying Roundup because if they sprayed Roundup on their corn, on their wheat, on their soybeans, they would kill their plants because it's an herbicide. It kills plants. So farmers wouldn't use as much and had to spend more time using it so that they had to make sure they weren't hitting their actual plants they wanted alive. But science has come in and essentially designed plants So Roundup Ready soybeans, for example. They've designed plants so that it has a gene that makes it that if you spray Roundup on it, it won't kill the plant. That soybean is actually able to take that Roundup and break it down and not be impacted by it. So that's what you're seeing in this picture. So here we have regular crops and weeds and a Roundup Ready crop. Roundup Ready is the GMO name for it. Roundup Ready soybeans. Here's Roundup, that pesticide, that herbicide that kills plants, and regular crops and weeds die because it's an herbicide, and our Roundup Ready crops, totally fine. They're like, Roundup, I can just break it down and live another day. One of the downsides, and we're going to explore this more, is like now farmers just use more Roundup. Because instead of having to be really careful and only spraying it on their weeds, they can spray it on their entire field and know that they're not going to kill their Roundup Ready crops. So, yeah, something interesting, something to explore more. So with that was just a quick intro into what GMOs are and what cultivar means, what GMO means. And what we're going to be exploring next is their impact to human health and to the environment.